Recording a macro to the personal macro workbook. So far, we have recorded macros to this workbook, that is, the workbook that you currently have open. That means that the macro will work in that workbook only. If you would like a macro to work for every single workbook that you open, then you have to save or store that macro into the personal macro workbook. Let's record a macro and store it into the personal macro workbook. So we start off like we've done with all other macros. We go to the Developer tab and we click Record Macro. Then we give the macro a name. So for example, let's say I call it months. And instead of storing it in this workbook, we're going to store it in this option called the Personal Macro Workbook. So now I'm going to press the OK button. I'm going to use relative references and I'm going to type in the word Jan and I'm going to drag it across as far as June, and then I'm going to click underneath in A2 and then I'm going to stop recording. So I've recorded myself putting in headings relatively, so the headings should go wherever I click on the page. But because I stored it into the personal macro workbook, it should work on all workbooks. So let's firstly try it on this workbook. So I'm going to go into macros. I'm going to change this so that I can see all open workbooks, which will include my personal workbook. So there it is there. And I click run. And we can see that it ran the macro in the position that I was in. Let's say I open up a brand new workbook. And in here, I also want to run that macro, and I can see it because it belongs to the personal macro workbook. Clicking run, and it works here too. If I close either of these workbooks and don't make any saves, we'll see here that it never asked me to save one of the workbooks, in the sense that the macro doesn't belong to any of those workbooks. It belongs to the personal macro workbook. So when you save a macro to the personal macro workbook and you go to close the whole of Excel down, you then will get a warning saying that if you want to save the changes you've made to the personal macro workbook, you have to click yes. It's very important here that you press save. If you don't press save, then you won't have saved the macro that you currently just made into the personal macro workbook. So by clicking save, I'm closing Excel, but I'm also saving the macro so that it's there for me every time that I come in. For the moment, I'm just going to press cancel. I'm going to open a brand new workbook and we're just going to run through those steps again. So when you click record macro, we give the macro a name, so this time I might call it years. And the bit that you must remember is where you're storing the macro, and we're storing it to the personal macro workbook so that it's available to us no matter where we are. When I press the OK button, I record my macro as normal, so I might put in 2012 and then drag that across to 13, 14 and so on. So I might just put in the second one here for 13. Drag the two across and then I'll get 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. I might highlight them all and in the Home tab press Center and Bold and then click underneath. Back into the Developer tab and stop recording. So now if I go to macros, I now see the months and the years. Clicking on Run, it now does the years macro for me. And if I go into a brand new workbook, I can now go into macros and I can still see the two that I placed into the personal macro workbook. And you'll notice that it does say the word personal in front of them because it doesn't belong to this workbook, it belongs to the personal macro workbook.